Alright, hello everyone, welcome to this course video. Today's focus will be on the classifications and the objectives of a business. And so when we're looking at our learning objectives specifically, by the end of this video you should be able to understand the types of businesses. So those include sole trader partnerships, public and private listed companies, our social enterprises and government business enterprises. Be able to explain the objectives of a business. So those are to make a profit, increase market share, improve efficiency, to improve effectiveness, fulfill a market need, fulfill a social need, and also meet shareholder expectations. And then towards the end of the video, we'll be looking at answering some SAC/exam styled short answer questions. Alright, so as I just mentioned, we have 6 types of businesses you need to know. We'll begin by looking at our sole trader business structure. So the characteristics of a sole trader is that it's owned and operated by a single person. This person is, they have the responsibility of providing finance and capital, to fund the business and to ensure that, it has sufficient finance to run its everyday operations. The owner is also legally responsible and they're in control of every business aspect. So kind of links to an advantage of a sole trader because whatever vision the owner has for that business, they're entitled to make decisions as they see fit, and therefore they're in complete control of the business and its direction and where it's headed. But it's also subjected to unlimited liability. So this means that the owner and the business, they're regarded as the same entity, meaning that in the case that the business incurs any debts or, fails to, pay off its debts or isn't performing as well, the owner's personal assets can be seized in order to compensate for those the debts of the business. So in that case, the owner is held personally liable. Alrighty, and then we have our partnership characteristics. So with our partnership, this is where it's owned and operated by 2 to 20 people, a bit more than a sole trader. So more than one. So you would say just more than one, but no more than 20. So between 2 to 20. And so agreements made between business partners can be written, oral, or implied. And like a sole trader, it's also subjected to unlimited liability. So essentially, owners are regarded as the same entity as the business. Therefore, if the business liquidates or falls into debt, the owners of a partnership will be held personally liable to compensate for that. Okay, and then we have private limited company. So their characteristics. Now we're looking at more of more of an incorporated business structure. So I'm going to jump straight to that third dot point, but this is where we have limited liability now. So shareholders are separate legal entities from the company. So we no longer have, there are owners, but the core focus of the private limited company is that we have shareholders. So specifically 1 to 20 non-employee shareholders. Remember that shareholders are essentially people who have purchased a proportion of the company in the form of shares, and in return for their investment, in return for that investment into that company, they are going to be receiving a amount of the business's profit as a return on their investment, and that's just called a dividend. With a private listed company, they're not listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, which just means that the public is not able to buy shares in the company, meaning that if you are a shareholder of a private limited company, you have to be invited to be a shareholder. Not anyone from the public can be a shareholder of a private limited company. And then we went through the third one. The last dot point is that it has perpetuity, which just means that in the case of the original owners, if they leave the business or if they, pass away potentially, the business can continue to operate. So for example, with Apple, even though Steve Jobs, the original owner, the original founder of Apple, no longer exists, Apple still continues to be one of, the leading, companies of the world today. So just means that the company can continue to operate regardless of who leaves or who enters the business. Then we have a public listed company. So this is where you have more than 50 non-employee shareholders. So there's no limit on the number of shareholders you have now. So with a private limited company, you could only have between 1 and 50, but with public listed companies, really, it's unlimited. So it's just more than 50. Now we are with a public listed company. It's listed on the Australian Stock Exchanges because anyone can buy shares, anyone can become a shareholder to this company type. And there's also a lot more legal obligations that are subjected to a public listed company. So the business must frequently publish its financial information. They need to produce the accounting reports, annual financial statements, just so that the public is able to see and maybe make educated decisions on their investment to become a shareholder to that company. Anyways, so then we have limited liability. So again, shareholders are separate legal entities from the company. So essentially what this means is, say I hold a 1% share in the company. If the company falls into debt or liquidates, I'm just going to lose that 1% that I've invested into the company. All the burden isn't going on to me. So since there's so many shareholders, since there's more than 50 shareholders, the risk and the burden that is experienced is sort of spread among the shareholders. So they're just essentially held liable for the amount of investment they hold in that company. And again, we have perpetuity. All right, and then we have our social enterprise characteristics. So with our social enterprises, these operate like a normal business, but they aim to distribute profits back to a community cause. So while they have a focus on a community cause, they still would have a really important sole focus on making profits, because without money, without making profit, it's really hard to run a business. But essentially, what they do with those profits is a little bit more different in terms of just reinvesting that towards a key community cause. And their primary objective is to fulfill a social need. We'll go through the different business objectives in the next slides, but their key one would be on fulfilling that social need. It could be the environment, it could be the society, it could be the economy, just depending on what that key focus is. And like I mentioned before, it just requires profits to achieve that. And then it also would reinvest a proportion of those profits into itself so that it can continue operating as well. And then we have our GBEs, so Government Business Enterprise. They are a public government sector organization that operates like a business. So it's essentially just a business owned by the government, and their profits will be returned to their shareholder/owner, which is the government. So all profits will be held by the government, and their main objective is to provide a necessary service, even if providing that service isn't profitable. So if you think about some government business enterprises, some good examples would be like Australia Post, you have Vic Roads. All of these are examples of necessary services. The government sort of takes on that responsibility in terms of providing that. Okay, and then we have our business objectives. So remember business objectives, essentially the definition of what a business objective is. So they're a goal that provide direction, incentive, and purpose for management and employees within an organization. So essentially they exist to give purpose and direction to a business. So everyone is aware of where the business is heading, where it wants to go, and can accordingly align their efforts in ensuring that the business achieves that goal or objective, or wherever they want to be in that future. So we have a couple of business objectives. So the first one is to make a profit. Pretty self-explanatory. So essentially being profitable, profit is given by the equation of revenue minus expenses, so either increasing revenue or potentially decreasing expenses. The second one is to increase market share. So market share is the proportion of sales that a business holds in a particular industry or market. And so wherever a business, is seeking to drive up their sales. If they increase their sales, that would subsequently lead to an increase in market share as well. The third one is to improve efficiency. Efficiency, I like to think of as very similar to productivity. It's how well the business uses its resources to achieve its objectives. But yeah, essentially, how well is it using its inputs? How is it creating its outputs? Things like that. But you'll look at the concept of efficiency and effectiveness in Unit 3, Area Study 3. So those concepts will definitely be a lot more clear to you by the end of that area of study. And then there's also to improve effectiveness. Effectiveness is all about how well the business has been at achieving their business objectives. Then we have to fulfill a market need. So is there any gaps in the market that is currently existing? How well can a business actually, achieve that and fulfill that? Then we have to fulfill a social need. So like we looked at in the previous slides with the social enterprise, what is there in the community that potentially needs attention? So that would link to fulfilling a social need. Then we have to meet shareholder expectations. So it's also important to think about, like, with these different business objectives, what business objectives would be applicable to the different business structures. So with that shareholder expectations, important to realize that that's only applicable to your private and your public listed companies, because your sole trader and partnerships, they don't have shareholders, they only have owners. So that one, the last one, would be, it would be more so for those public and private listed companies. But what shareholder expectations mean is that obviously when you invest into a company, when someone invests into the company and they become a shareholder, they expect the company to be making decisions that would allow a greater return on their investment. So they would be expecting the company to, make decisions that would increase profit. Also just being transparent to shareholders, being honest, being clear, having good communication, things like that. Okay, so let's have a look at the short answer questions. So the first one, referring to one example, outline the characteristics of a social enterprise. So with your short answer questions, the first thing that you should be thinking about when you're answering a question is, what is the task word? So the key task word here is outline, which just means that you need to provide maybe a brief description of the key concept that the question is asking you about. So in this case, it would be social enterprise and the characteristics of one. And then also the key part of the question, another key part of the question is it's asking you to refer to one example. So in your response, outlining the characteristics would not be sufficient. You would also need to provide an example in order to, demonstrate your understanding, but also answer that part of the question as well. So just make sure that when you do read a question, you make note of like the different parts of the question and also what might, the question limit you to. So if you talked about 2 examples, that's, you're not answering the question. You'd only be marked on your first example that you provide. So just make note of the question and then obviously highlight your task word and then think about how you might, how that task word would influence the way you structure your question. So let's have a look at the sample response. So a social enterprise is a business which distributes its profits to a community cause. One such example is Street Cafe, which operates 7 cafes around Melbourne. The revenue is then invested into the upskilling of disadvantaged and homeless youth. The primary objective of a social enterprise is to fulfill a social need. The qualifications and experience provided by Street help prevent unemployment and homelessness among people. So when we're breaking this down, maybe I'll just get a pen here. So we have this first part of the question. That is your definition. So that's your definition. I'm just going to write def for, hopefully that's clear. But yeah, that first part of your question is your definition. So that just, it's a good way to start your response by demonstrating your understanding of a social enterprise, just highlighting that you know what this business structure is. And then they've gone on to talk about that example, and they've jumped straight into that example, where they've said one such example is Street Cafe, which operates 7 cafes around Melbourne. So just giving a bit of an introduction to their example. The revenue is then invested into the upskilling of disadvantaged and homeless youth. So you want to make it really clear what that key community cause is that the case study or that your example is linking to. So they've done that in this sentence where they've highlighted that the revenue is invested into the upskilling of disadvantaged and homeless youth. So just making it clear that it's reinvested into the community. The community cause specifically is focusing on increasing the skill level of disadvantaged and homeless youth. The primary objective of social enterprises is to fulfill a social need. So just reiterating that characteristic, which is to fulfill a social need. So that's another characteristic they've talked about. Actually, yeah. And then the qualifications and experience provided by Street help prevent unemployment and homelessness among young people. So again, highlighting how how the social enterprises is working to, I guess, address that community cause and really look at preventing unemployment, homelessness among young people, which is applicable to that example. So essentially how this question has been tackled is they've used one example, and through that example, they've answered that second part of the question, which is asking you to outline the characteristics of that social enterprise. So I think that's probably an efficient way to answer the question rather than outlining the characteristics generally and then separately, like using an example to trying to relate to it. It's easier if you just maybe provide your definition of a social enterprise and then go straight into your example and then link your example, use your example as a way of demonstrating your knowledge of the characteristics and using specific evidence from that example so that you're linking it to those parts of the question. Okay, awesome. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's continue on. So the second question we have is outline the characteristics of a private limited company. So keyword here is outline. So again, just briefly providing characteristics of a particular concept, particular idea. In this case, we need to be linking it to the characteristics of a private limited company. Okay, so this one's worth 2 marks, so nothing too crazy, but essentially what we're looking at is starting off with a bit of a definition. So one characteristic of a private limited company is that this type of business has 1 to 50 non-employee shareholders, people who have purchased proportions of the business. So they've started by underlining, jumping straight into it by providing that the first characteristic. I think it's quite good that they've used this signposting as well, just making it clear that they're talking about their first characteristic. So it's always good just saying one characteristic is, or my second characteristic, the characteristic is X. So that clear signposting just makes it super clear to the examiner what you're referring to, where you're going with your response. And then, they've said, so they've said the characteristic of a private limited company is that this type of business has 1 to non-50 employee shareholders. So that's key part of that question. So key part of that first characteristic. 1 to 50 non-shareholders. And then they've taken an extra step and they've also demonstrated their understanding of what a shareholder is. So in brackets, they've put people who have purchased proportions of the business. So again, just going that extra step looks a bit more impressive as well. But it doesn't take very long, just putting it in small little brackets, demonstrating that you know what a shareholder is. And then they've said another characteristic is that it has unlimited liability, which just means that in the case, meaning that the business and its owners / shareholders are considered separate legal entities. So again, they've used a bit of signposting here with that another characteristic part of that question, and they've highlighted that it has limited liability in this case, as we know, because only sole traders and partnerships have unlimited liability, where the owner is personally liable. But since this is a private limited company, the owner or / shareholders, they're considered separate legal entities, so they're not going to be held personally liable. Rather, it's just their percentage of investment in the company that they'll lose. But yeah, they've underlined what limited liability means, meaning that the business and its owners / shareholders are considered separate legal entities. So I'll just bracket that as well, just to make it clear what characteristic or what key part of that characteristic they've talked about. Awesome. So key things with like short answer questions is just make note of like the task words as well, because the way, depending on the task word that you get, sort of influences your way you respond to the question as well. So let's move on to another one. So now we have define business objectives and provide an example. So here our task word is define, and then we need to define business objectives, and we also need to provide an example. So I would also be highlighting this to remind myself that I cannot forget to provide an example, because otherwise we will not be getting full marks. So let's have a look at the sample response. Business objectives are the goals that provide direction, incentive, and purpose for management and employees within an organization. So that first part is that definition. An example of a business objective for all business structures is to improve market share, which refers to increasing the number of sales a business holds in a particular industry. And so they've provided an example of that business objective. So we know that with business objectives, there's so many different ones we looked at earlier on in this video. But essentially, an example they've used is that's applicable to all business structures is to improve market share. So that's a good one, because regardless of the type of business you are, you would always have that aim of improving your sales, increasing your revenue, and like we established before, profit is essential to maintain the operations of your company or your business. So market share is applicable. You could have even talked about to increase profit. But yeah, any of the business objectives that used as an example would have been right. Okay, so to improve market share, that refers to increasing the number of sales a business holds in a particular industry. So they've also gone and elaborated on what the specific business objective is, which you should have done. So depending on the example that you provided, it's good just to give a bit of a description on what that business objective is and what that entails for the business. So that refers to increasing the number of sales. So number of sales is a really key part of this. Business holds in a particular industry. All right, awesome. Let's continue. Amazing. Okay, so that essentially brings us to the end of this course video. So if we are just to review what we have covered the different business structures. So those were including sole trader, partnership, private listed companies, public listed companies, as well as social enterprises and government business enterprises as well. We had a look at the different business objectives. So you had to increase market share, to make a profit, to improve efficiency, to increase effectiveness, to fulfill a market need, to fulfill a social need, and to meet shareholder expectations. And then lastly, towards the end of our class, we simply looked at answering SAC/exam style questions, really breaking the question down, understanding what it requires us to do so that when we are answering the question, we can answer it most effectively, ensuring that we're getting the most marks as we can in responding to it. All right, awesome. I'll see you all next video.